I need you to hear the last thing my son said to me at his grandfather's graveside, because I have replayed it every single morning since, and I still cannot make it sound like something a person says to their mother. He looked at me across that hole in the ground, across those 40-odd years of family history we were about to seal under 6 feet of California clay, and he said, "I choose my father-in-law's money, Mom." He said it the way people say pass the salt, flat, transactional, like he was signing off on an invoice he had been meaning to settle for years. Like 23 years of my life, my cooking, my silence, my sacrificed Thursdays, my blood pressure, my name, amounted to a line item he was finally closing out. I stood there in my rust-colored cardigan with the wooden buttons, the one I always reach for when I need something to physically hold me together, and I did not cry. I did not scream. I looked at my son, and I thought one thing. He does not know. He has no idea what his grandfather actually did. He has absolutely no idea what I have been quietly holding in my hands this entire time. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need to understand where I was before that moment could exist. Come back with me to a Tuesday morning in spring, when Oakland is doing that thing it does in April. Tentative warmth, eucalyptus smell drifting in from the hills, light sitting low and golden over the brick row houses along our street. The working-class neighborhood where I live is not picturesque in the way magazines would photograph it. It is honest. Small front porches with plastic chairs, neighbors who nod and mean it, kids cutting through yards the way kids do when they've grown up treating the whole block as theirs. I have always loved that about this neighborhood, the way it holds itself together without pretending. I rent the second-floor apartment in an old Victorian house that has been divided into units, and it has the creakiest stairs you have ever heard in your life. Every morning those stairs announce me to whoever is awake below. Every morning I walk down to the shared entry and retrieve the paper, and every morning I walk back up with those stairs speaking under my feet like they are marking time. That particular Tuesday I am standing at the kitchen sink, watching the sun come up through the window. That is one of my favorite things, the way early light hits the row of brick houses across the street and turns them amber for about 11 minutes before the angle shifts. My rust-colored cardigan, my bare feet on the linoleum, on the counter, propped against the sugar jar where it has lived for 3 years, is my worn leather Bible with handwritten notes in the margins. My mother's handwriting, small letters, certain and unhurried, pressed into the paper next to verses about endurance and faithfulness. I had been reading her words every morning, trying to locate the woman I used to be before I made myself invisible for this family. On the table sits a dish of macaroni and cheese baked golden on top that I made 2 days ago and haven't been able to bring myself to eat. Food does that during grief. It becomes obligation. You make something warm because your hands need something to do, and then you look at it and feel nothing. Spring that year was supposed to mean something. In Oakland, when the windows finally open after winter and you can smell the neighborhood again instead of just hearing it, that is when I have always felt like life was possible, like the year was still offering itself. That spring, I had not felt that in years. I had not let myself feel it, because somewhere in the slow erosion of the previous decade, I had learned to keep my expectations sealed. I did not know yet, standing at that sink, that this spring would be different. That within 6 months I would be sitting on my porch at 11:18 p.m. with a cracked picture frame and blood on my palm, and that sitting next to me would be the woman who would help me change everything. That before another year passed, I would stand in front of 42 members of this family with documents in my hands that would make them understand exactly who they had been dealing with all along. I did not know any of that yet. What I knew was the Bible on the counter, the cooling macaroni, the creaky stairs, the windows open for the first time since October, and a feeling, low and persistent, like a frequency I couldn't quite name, that something in this family was wrong in a way I had been choosing not to fully see. That feeling had been there for 2 years. I had been calling it grief. I had been calling it exhaustion. I had been calling it adjustment. It was none of those things. And somewhere in the back of my chest, I think I already knew it. If you have ever felt that low, insistent wrongness you keep explaining away, stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you is for you. Let me tell you something about believing in forgiveness as a survival strategy. When it is genuine, when it comes from a place of wholeness, forgiveness is one of the most powerful things a human being can offer. But when forgiveness becomes a reflex, when you deploy it automatically every time someone wrongs you because you have been taught that blood is thicker than accountability, it stops being a virtue. It becomes a door you leave unlocked for people who have already proven they will walk through it uninvited. I believe blood and family must always be forgiven. That is the belief that kept me in place for 11 years. I grew up in a church where that teaching was delivered every Sunday, reinforced in the hymns, pressed into the pages of every Bible in every pew. Forgive 70 times 7. Honor thy family. Be the woman who holds it together. I had taken those lessons and built a life around them, and by the time I understood how they had been used against me, the architecture was already load-bearing. Raymond, my father-in-law, was charming in the way that men who plan things carefully tend to be charming. He was generous at family gatherings. He brought my son Marcus gifts that felt like love and were actually leverage. He told stories at dinner that made everyone laugh. And he watched people over the rim of his glass while they laughed, cataloging what they wanted and what they feared. I saw this. I saw it for years. But every time my stomach tightened around it, I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself that a man who comes to Christmas dinner with a bag of presents for the grandchildren he doesn't actually know very well is just a man who wants connection, not a man who is buying goodwill one transaction at a time. And Marcus, my son, my boy, the child I raised in this city on a teacher's salary and a lot of determination, Marcus wanted his grandfather's approval so badly it changed his shape. I watched it happen gradually, the way water changes stone. He started talking differently around Raymond. He stopped disagreeing with him. He started repeating Raymond's opinions as his own, about business, about money, about what a man was supposed to accomplish. The fortune Raymond had spent his life accumulating became the measuring stick by which Marcus decided his own life was insufficient. I tried to talk to Marcus about it. He told me I was jealous. He told me I didn't understand how generational wealth worked. He told me I was the problem, always making things complicated, always seeing darkness where there was just family. And because I believe blood and family must always be forgiven, I accepted that. I smoothed it over. I apologized for noticing. What did I sacrifice? Everything that makes you a person rather than a function. I stopped calling my friends from church, the Thursday domino evenings that had kept me laughing and sharp and connected to myself. I gave those up because Marcus said the women were a bad influence, that they gossiped, that I was better than that. I put the hymnal from my mother's funeral on a high shelf and stopped letting myself open it because grief had become another thing I was not supposed to make space for. I was a mother, a daughter-in-law, a support structure. Grief was not in the job description. I forgot who I was before them. That is the truest thing I can tell you about that period. I forgot that before Marcus needed me, and before Raymond needed to be managed, and before my ex-husband needed to be forgiven and let go, I had been a woman who knew her own mind, who kept score at dominoes, who could read her mother's handwriting and feel strong. That woman went somewhere quiet inside me, and for years I did not check on her. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, I was feeding everyone. Macaroni and cheese baked golden on top, The kind that comes out of the oven with a crust that crackles when you press the spoon down. That dish is memory for me. It is the smell of Sunday afternoons, of family being genuine before it became performance. I kept making it. I kept feeding the table. I kept showing up. The first crack I should have listened to came in the winter before any of this began. Raymond asked me to sign something for estate planning purposes while we were at the kitchen table after one of those Sunday dinners. He had a folder. He was casual about it. He said it was just housekeeping, paperwork that named me as a secondary beneficiary contact in some filing. Marcus nodded like this was normal. I looked at the document, but it was dense, and Raymond was already talking about something else, and the macaroni was getting cold, and I told myself I would look at it properly later. I did not look at it properly later. I am telling you this because I want you to feel the specific texture of how this kind of thing happens. It is not dramatic. Nobody twirls a mustache. It is just a folder on a kitchen table while the food is getting cold, and everybody seems relaxed, and you have trained yourself for 11 years to believe that your discomfort is the problem, not the situation creating it. You sign the paper. You pass the salt. You tell yourself later. Are you feeling that? Because if you are, I need you to hear me clearly. Your discomfort is not the problem. It is the answer. At the end of that winter, a bank statement arrived with my name on an account I did not remember opening. I almost convinced myself I had forgotten. Almost. Something changes in a woman when she stops crying and starts thinking. It is not a dramatic moment usually. It does not come with music or revelation. It comes quietly, at about 2 a.m, when you are sitting with a bank statement in your hand, and you realize the exhaustion of confusion is finally worse than the exhaustion of knowing. You get very still. Your mind clears the way a room clears when you open a window. And then you start pulling threads. I started with what I could access. Bank records, first. I had 3 accounts, a checking account in my name, a joint savings account I had opened with my ex-husband years ago, that Raymond had somehow remained attached to through a series of amendments I had never been shown, and now this 3rd account that had appeared on a statement with my name printed on it like I had consented to its existence. I printed everything. I spread it across the kitchen table in this old Victorian house with its creaky stairs, and I looked at it the way I used to look at a domino layout when I was figuring out the board, every tile telling me something about what was hidden. The numbers didn't add up. They didn't add up in the specific surgical way that numbers don't add up when someone has been very carefully moving money rather than stealing it outright. Small transfers, reorganizations, amendments to accounts that bore my name but that I had not initiated. $300 here, $4,000 there. And then, in March of 2019, a single transfer of $47 €0 restructured into a trust I had never heard of, executed while I was visiting my sister in Sacramento. I was not in the state when that signature was produced. My name was on that document. Someone had signed for me. I sat with that knowledge for 2 full days before I let myself say it plainly, even in my own mind. Forged signatures, fake contracts. The betrayal was documentary, cold, legal, deliberate. Raymond had not stolen from me with violence or anger. He had stolen from me with a pen and a folder on a kitchen table while the macaroni was getting cold, and then again and again and again over 5 years while I was busy forgiving everyone in this family and forgetting to protect myself. The worn leather Bible on the counter watched me those 2 days, my mother's handwriting in the margins. I kept touching it without opening it, just laying my hand flat on the cover the way you'd put your hand on someone's shoulder. It had always been a comfort, that Bible. My mother had carried it through things that would have stopped a lesser woman. Now it sat there and I could not open it, because I was afraid of what I would feel if I read her words about endurance while sitting in the middle of this particular truth. On the third night, I opened it, and something cracked. I had been holding everything very carefully, very precisely. The spreadsheets, the account numbers, the dates, the geography of my own absence during that March transfer. I had been treating it all like evidence, which it was, and I had been keeping my hand steady. But I opened that Bible to a page my mother had marked with a folded piece of prayer request paper from a Sunday service I don't remember, and her handwriting said, in the margin beside a verse about truth setting you free, "He who conceals will be revealed." Her certainty, in that small pressed script, her sureness about how the world operated. I picked up the wedding photo from my nightstand, the one I had kept for Marcus's sake, because I thought it was important for him to see that his parents had once chosen each other. I pressed it flat between my hands. I pressed until I felt the frame crack. The glass broke and cut my palm, and I sat down on the floor of this apartment, and I did not make a sound. I just sat with the broken frame and the bleeding hand and the hymnal my mother's church had given us at her funeral, the one I can't throw away no matter how many times I've thought about it, and I finally cried the way you cry when you've been carrying something too heavy for too long and your arms simply give out. That was my collapse. Not elegant, not controlled. Just a woman on a linoleum floor with a cut palm and a broken frame, and the full, unmedicated truth finally in the room with her. Now do you understand what it means to lose your identity to a family? Do you understand what it costs to sacrifice who you are in the name of keeping the peace? Because the peace was never real. It was just the silence of someone not getting caught yet. The key object, that worn leather Bible with my mother's notes, had always been my comfort. Now, every time I looked at it, I felt both her love and the gap between the woman she raised me to be and the woman who had let all of this happen on her watch. The Bible didn't stop being sacred, but it changed. It became evidence of how much I had abandoned myself. I knew the full shape of it now. The forgeries, the fake trust documents, the 5 years of incremental theft dressed up as estate planning. I knew it in my body, in my blood pressure, in the way my hands went numb at work the following Monday, and my vision blurred for 3 straight days until my doctor sat me down and said quietly, "Tell me what's happening in your life right now." She asked it the way doctors ask when they already know. I told her, and she said, "I think the stress is killing you." She was not being dramatic. There is a specific kind of clarity that arrives when grief finally burns down to its last residue, and what is left is something hard and smokeless and cold. Not anger, exactly. Anger is hot and unsteady. This was something else. This was focus. This was the feeling of a woman who has been crying on the floor and has now stood up, washed the blood off her hand, and decided that the floor is the last place she intends to be brought to her knees. In the hospital, waiting for test results, my blood pressure sitting at 178 over 112. My doctor's face arranged in that careful professional neutrality that means she is genuinely worried. I did one of the most important things I had ever done in my life. I called Raymond's estate attorney and asked him to send me copies of all documents bearing my name or my signature in connection with any estate, trust, or property filing in the previous 6 years. The envelope arrived 2 days after I was discharged. I sat at the kitchen table in my rust-colored cardigan, and I opened it the way you open something you already half know is going to change you. Slowly, methodically, with your breath held. There were 11 documents. My name appeared on 7 of them. My signature appeared on 6. I had signed 2 of them. The other 4 were not mine. I laid them out on the table. I went to my file cabinet, the green metal one I had kept since I bought this apartment, the one Marcus used to tease me about, saying I was the last person in Oakland who still kept paper. And I found my mortgage application from 2011. The one place where my authentic signature, witnessed and notarized by a licensed professional, sat clean and undeniable. I printed a photograph of it and laid it next to the 4 estate documents. You did not need to be a handwriting expert. You needed to be a person with 2 eyes. The loops were different. The angle was different. The way my real signature lifts slightly at the end of my last name, that personal idiosyncrasy that develops over decades of signing the same name, was absent on every forged document. Someone had tried. They had gotten close. But they had not gotten the lift. And now I had the two signatures side by side on my kitchen table, and there was no version of this that I could explain away. No version where I had simply forgotten. No version where Raymond's attorney had made an administrative error. No version where Marcus could look at this and tell me I was imagining things. I sat with that knowledge for exactly 14 minutes. I know because I watched the clock above the stove. I gave myself those 14 minutes to feel whatever I needed to feel. The vindication, the grief, the exhaustion of being right about something I had wished so desperately I was wrong about. Then I closed the folder, set it on top of the Bible, and thought about who else needed to see this. If you are listening to this and you have ever had someone tell you that you were too suspicious, too sensitive, too quick to see problems that weren't there, I need you to understand something. Your instincts are a filing cabinet. They keep everything. And sometimes the most important thing you will ever do is go back to that cabinet and actually look at what has been accumulating. Claudette found me that same night I had broken the picture frame and sat on the floor. She had heard something, or sensed something the way neighbors do in old buildings where the walls remember every sound. She knocked at 11:18 p.m. I know the time, because her knock was so gentle I thought I had imagined it. She is a woman from our church, my neighbor in the apartment below. A woman who carries her own history of survival in the set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her eyes. When she sat down on the porch next to me in the cold, she did not ask me what was wrong in the way that people ask when they want to be reassured you're fine. She asked me in the way that means she already knows something serious is happening, and she is simply waiting for permission to help. "Baby," she said, "what do you actually own?" I looked at her, and then I told her everything, not the managed version. Not the version where I protect Marcus because he is my son and I believe in forgiveness. All of it. The accounts, the signatures, the envelope from the attorney, the blood pressure, the floor. She listened without flinching, without interrupting, without the particular kind of sympathy that is actually just discomfort wearing a kind face. She just listened until I was done, and then she said, "I need you to come to my kitchen tomorrow morning. My cousin is a paralegal. I already know she'll want to see those documents." Claudette's cousin is named Patricia. She is a small, precise woman who carries reading glasses on a chain and asks questions the way a surgeon makes incisions, clean, deliberate, going exactly where she means to go. She sat at my table the next morning with the 11 documents and my mortgage application and my side-by-side signature comparison, and she read everything in silence for 19 minutes. Then she looked up and she said, "The notary stamp on documents 3, 5, and 7 belongs to a man who surrendered his license in 2017. I can verify this by end of day." She verified it by end of day. Raymond had not just forged my signature. He had used a disbarred notary to authenticate documents that were already fraudulent, which meant the fraud was layered, intentional, and verifiable. This was not an administrative error. This was a system. A careful, patient, long-planned system for moving wealth past a woman who had been trained to forgive everything and question nothing. I thought about the $47 Amory dollars. I thought about the trust I was not a party to. I thought about the net worth of what had been rerouted past my name over 5 years. I thought about the Lincoln Navigator in burgundy red that I had wanted for 11 years and never let myself purchase, because there was always something more important to spend money on, always something the family needed more than I needed the one beautiful thing I had ever allowed myself to want. I thought about all of that. And then I made a decision. Marcus wanted the inheritance. He was about to find out that the inheritance had a guardian, and the guardian had been paying attention. There is an art to appearing normal when you are quietly dismantling someone's entire false reality from the inside. I did not know I had this skill. I had spent 11 years performing peace for this family, smiling at Sunday dinners, asking Raymond polite questions about his health, sitting through conversations about wealth and legacy while I privately cataloged the 11 ways the conversation was designed to make me feel small. Turns out all of that practice had given me excellent preparation for the next 6 weeks. I showed up to everything. I attended the early estate planning meetings that Raymond's attorney had organized while Raymond was still in the hospital. The meetings where Marcus sat at the head of the table looking very much like a man who believed he was about to inherit something significant. I brought coffee, I listened. I asked occasional clarifying questions that sounded like the questions of a woman trying to understand, rather than a woman who already had a paralegal and a side-by-side signature comparison in a folder at home. I smiled at the right moments. I was gracious and quiet and cooperative and absolutely, completely invisible to everyone in that room, which was exactly what I needed to be. Meanwhile, Patricia was running down every document in that envelope. She confirmed the disbarred notary. She traced the trust structure that had received the $47,000 and found 2 additional transfers I had not yet identified. Smaller amounts, from 2020 and 2021, moved through a property account in Raymond's name that bore my signature on 3 amendments. When you added it all together, the total restructured past my name over 5 years approached $80,000. Not a fortune by some standards, but a meaningful, intentional theft from a woman who had given this family her identity for 11 years and never asked for anything back. Claudette was my anchor through those weeks. She would come upstairs in the evenings and sit with me while I worked through the documents, and she would say very little, but her presence made the apartment feel less like a place where something bad had happened, and more like a place where something was being fixed. She brought food sometimes, the kind of food that does not need to be reciprocated. That is just sustenance delivered by someone who understands that you are currently spending all of your energy on something important and cannot also cook. She never made me feel small for needing help. She made me feel like needing help was simply what happened when you were carrying something real. The liberation symbol happened on a Thursday. Not a Thursday with dominoes. I was not yet back to that. But an ordinary Thursday afternoon when I walked out of the grocery store with a bunch of sunflowers I had picked up from the display by the entrance. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the store, holding those sunflowers, and I realized I had bought them for no one but myself, with my own money, without asking permission, without considering whether it was a practical purchase, without calculating whether I deserved something beautiful. I stood there and I cried, right on the sidewalk in front of the grocery store, holding sunflowers. People walked around me the way people do in Oakland, respectfully, without staring. I cried for about 90 seconds, and then I wiped my face and walked to my car and drove home and put those sunflowers in the only vase I owned, and I set it on the kitchen table next to my mother's Bible, and I told myself, this is what it feels like to exist for yourself. Remember it. Hold it in your body like a map. Now. I need to tell you about the close call because it matters. 11 days before the memorial dinner, Marcus stopped by the apartment without calling. This was unusual. Marcus rarely came to my home since I had moved out of the house we had shared. He stood in the doorway looking at my kitchen table, where I had made the mistake of leaving a printed email from Patricia about the notary records. It was face down, but the email address visible on the back header included Patricia's name and the words, Estate Document Review. Marcus looked at the table. He looked at me. What are you working on? He said. And here is the moment. Here is the thing that no one tells you about having performed peace for 11 years. When the performance is finally in service of something true, you get very good at it very fast. I looked at him and I said, I'm trying to understand the estate documents Raymond's attorney sent me. I keep getting confused by the trust language. I shook my head like a woman who is simply bewildered by legal paperwork. You know how I am with all that. I've been asking Claudette's cousin to help me read it. He relaxed. I watched his shoulders drop. He told me I didn't need to worry about it, that the attorneys had everything handled, that I should just focus on getting through the grief process. He said grief process like it was a technical term he had learned recently and wanted to use correctly. He patted my arm on his way out the door. After he left, I stood in the kitchen for 3 full minutes without moving. Then I turned the printed email over, put it in the folder, and called Patricia. We are doing this at the memorial dinner, I said. 2 weeks from Thursday. I need everything ready by then. She said, It's already ready. I went and stood in front of the sunflowers, turned toward the window, toward the light. The trap was being set, and no one who needed to stay ignorant had any idea. Raymond's memorial dinner was held on a Thursday evening in late May, spring edging toward summer, the air in Oakland still soft and carrying that particular scent of jasmine and exhaust and something green that the Bay always puts into the air this time of year. The event was organized by Raymond's sister Diane at her home in Piedmont, a neighborhood of large houses and wide driveways, where the income level shifts about 40 degrees north of the brick row houses and small porches where I live. 42 family members had been invited. The dinner was framed as a celebration of Raymond's life and an opportunity for the family to come together and discuss the estate in a unified, loving way. That is exactly what Marcus had told me, verbatim, when he called to confirm I was coming. It's going to be a celebration, Mom. A chance for the family to come together in a loving, unified way. He sent a car to collect me, not the Lincoln Navigator in burgundy red. That was Raymond's affectation, a vehicle Marcus had coveted and spoken about with a reverence that embarrassed me every time. No, Marcus sent a regular sedan, which arrived with a driver who did not speak and held the door open with the mechanical courtesy of someone performing a gesture for which they had been explicitly instructed. I sat in the back seat in my rust-colored cardigan and my good shoes, and I held my folder on my lap, and I looked out the window at Oakland going past. And I thought about my mother's handwriting in the margins of that Bible. He who conceals will be revealed. I had her handwriting memorized by that point. I had read it enough times in the dark hours of the previous weeks that I could see it behind my eyes. Patricia had prepared 2 copies of everything, the original documents with forged signatures, the mortgage application with my authentic signature, the notary research showing the disbarred stamp, the bank records tracing the $80,000 in transfers, and a formal letter from a licensed forensic document examiner who had reviewed the signatures and provided a written opinion that 4 of the estate documents bore signatures inconsistent with the authenticated signature on file. That last piece had cost me $600 I had taken directly from the account I had quietly opened in my name only, at a bank Raymond's family had never used, 6 weeks prior. Best $600 I have ever spent. Claudette had wanted to come. I told her I needed her to be available by phone, and that was the truth. If anything went sideways, she was the person I trusted to stay calm. She told me she would be home all evening. She told me to stand straight when I walked in. I arrived early. Diane was in the kitchen supervising the catering, and when she saw me at the door, she came and hugged me with the genuine warmth of a woman who had been, for years, quietly troubled by things she could not yet name. Diane had always treated me with more respect than Marcus or Raymond ever did. She had intuition about people, that woman, the kind of intuition that accrues in women who have spent decades paying attention. I'm glad you came early, she said. I wanted a chance to talk to you before it got crowded. I'm glad too, I said. There are some things I need to share with this family tonight. Diane. Before the meal, I need to know you're going to let me finish before anyone stops me. She looked at my folder. She looked at my face. And Diane, who had survived Raymond's particular brand of family management for 61 years, said, You have the floor, baby, as long as you need it. I set my folder on the side table in the entryway, and I went and helped her in the kitchen. Because that is the kind of woman I am. And because there was macaroni that needed to go in the oven, and I have always believed that useful hands make for a steadier heart. We worked together for 40 minutes while the family arrived in groups, while Marcus arrived with his wife and his father-in-law, while people settled into the comfort of a large house with good food smells and the familiar luxury of someone else having organized everything. I watched Marcus's father-in-law from across the room, Gerald, the man Marcus had publicly chosen over his own mother at a graveside. Gerald was a man of deliberate wealth. The income he projected was in his watch, his handshake, his practiced ease with rooms full of people who wanted something from him. He had invested in Marcus the way a businessman invests in a promising asset. He had seen Raymond's estate as a potential return on that investment. He had encouraged Marcus to position himself as the primary heir. He had absolutely no idea that the estate's central document was a fraud, and that the woman he had helped dismiss at a graveside had the receipts. When the room settled, when the 42 family members had located their seats and their drinks and were preparing for the warmth of a celebration, I picked up my folder from the side table. I walked to the center of the room. Diane caught my eye from across the table and gave me one small, deliberate nod. And before the meal was served, I opened the folder. The room had no idea what was about to happen, but I did. Before anyone discusses this estate, you should know that my name appears on contracts I never signed, and I have the originals to prove it. 42 people went completely quiet. The specific quality of that silence. Not the comfortable silence of a room settling, but the arrested, pressurized silence of a room that has just had a very large object thrown into it, is something I will remember for the rest of my life. I heard a fork set down. I heard someone's chair scrape backward. I heard Marcus, from across the table, say my name in a tone I had never heard from him before. Not dismissive, not condescending. Afraid. I did not look at him. Not yet. I have documentation, I said, and my voice was even. This surprised me. My voice was entirely, completely even. These are copies for anyone who would like to verify what I'm saying. The originals are with my attorney. This was a half-truth. Patricia was not yet my formal legal attorney, but she was working with one, and the phrase served its purpose. There are 4 documents in this estate filing that bear a signature claiming to be mine. I have provided a comparison signed by a forensic document examiner. She found them inconsistent with my authenticated signature. I also have records showing that the notary stamp on documents 3, 5, and 7 belonged to a man who surrendered his notary license in 2017. I placed the copies on the table. I slid stacks toward the people nearest me, and those people passed them down the way you pass bread, except that nobody was eating anymore. Gerald picked up his stack and looked at it the way people look at things they understand but wish they didn't. Marcus picked up his stack and looked at it the way people look at things they have been hoping will somehow not be real. "This is," Marcus started. "I'm not finished," I said. He went quiet. "You want to know what the room looked like from where I was standing? I will tell you." Diane, sitting at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression holding the particular combination of grief and confirmation that belongs to someone who suspected this for years and is now watching it verified in real time. Gerald's attorney, who had come to this dinner, which tells you how confident Gerald had been about the outcome, sitting with his copy of the documents and looking at his client with an expression that was professionally blank, but communicating volumes. Marcus's wife with her hand over her mouth. The cousins, the aunts, the family friends who had known Raymond for decades, reading the forensic examiner's report with the focused attention of people who are realizing that something they have trusted has been comprehensively false. Raymond transferred $80, $1,000 of restructured assets through documents that included my forged signature, I said. These transfers began in March of 2019 while I was out of state. The money moved into a trust I was not a party to and was never informed about. I have bank records here as well. I placed those on the table. I am not asking this family for anything tonight except the truth. But before any inheritance is distributed, this family deserves to know that the document foundation of this estate has been compromised. Then I looked at Marcus. I had been waiting for this moment without knowing it for 11 years. I had been building to this moment through every Sunday dinner, every signed document I had been too trusting to read, every Thursday evening I gave up, every time I had been told I was imagining things, every morning I had stood at the kitchen sink looking at the light and trying to remember who I was. You said you choose his money, I said, and I gestured toward Gerald. You should have made sure it was actually his to give. Marcus opened his mouth. I have been signing my name to this family for 23 years, I said. Turns out the only signature that mattered was the one on the deed. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And then Diane put both hands flat on the table and said, in the voice of a woman who has been waiting 61 years for permission to speak plainly. Raymond told me years ago that he had found a way to simplify the estate. I should have asked more questions. She looked at Marcus. You knew something was wrong. I saw your face when the attorney called. Marcus said nothing. His father-in-law, Gerald, for the first time since I had ever encountered him, looked uncertain. His attorney leaned over and said something quietly into his ear. Gerald's expression shifted from uncertain to calculating to something that looked, briefly, like the beginning of withdrawal. Because Gerald was a businessman, he understood documents, he understood notary records, he understood forensic examinations, and he understood that a man who had aligned himself with a fraudulent estate to secure an inheritance for his son-in-law was not positioned safely. He understood that the profit he had expected from this alliance was now a liability. I think, Gerald's attorney said, addressing the room, that this family needs to consult with separate legal counsel before any further estate discussions take place. Gerald did not object. Marcus sat at that table and watched his father-in-law begin to disengage in real time. Watched the investment Gerald had made in him quietly recalculate itself into a loss. Watched 42 family members read documents that made it impossible to pretend the estate was clean. Watched his mother stand at the center of a room and speak plainly without her voice shaking even once. I thought about forgiveness. I thought about how I had applied it like a balm to every wound this family had ever given me. I thought about the loan of my identity, the sacrifice of my Thursdays, the forged lines of my name on paper in rooms I had never been in. I thought about the blood pressure medication I now took every morning next to a glass of water at the same kitchen sink, where I had stood watching the sun come up and feeling like life might still be possible. I did not feel vindication the way I had expected to feel it. What I felt was simpler than that. What I felt was solid, like the floor under my feet was the right floor. Like my name, finally, was being said in the correct context. I collected my originals, picked up my folder, and sat down. The meal was served. I ate. The consequences did not arrive with drama. That is the thing about real justice. It does not move the way it does in movies. It arrives through letters, through phone calls from attorneys, through the slow, bureaucratic machinery of institutions that exist to process exactly this kind of situation. It arrives while you are doing the dishes, or standing at the kitchen sink watching the morning light, or sitting on your porch with a cup of coffee and the particular peace of a woman who no longer needs to brace for what is coming. Diane had Marcus formally removed from the estate proceedings within 3 weeks of the dinner. She had consulted her own attorney, a woman named Sandra who moved through legal documentation with the quiet authority of someone who has been doing this for 30 years, and Sandra confirmed that the forged documents made the existing estate structure legally unenforceable as written. The probate court was notified. An investigation was opened into the disbarred notary and into the attorney Raymond had used, who subsequently surrendered his license. The $80,000 in restructured assets was ordered returned to the estate in its proper configuration, which meant returned, in practical terms, to an accounting that included what I was owed. Gerald withdrew. Not with an apology. Men like Gerald do not apologize, They simply redirect, but completely and decisively. The investment he had made in Marcus dissolved when it became clear that the inheritance Marcus had been positioned to receive was not going to materialize in the form anyone had planned. Gerald was a businessman. The business had gone bad. He moved on. Marcus, who had built his identity around his grandfather's approval and his father-in-law's resources, found himself holding neither. The family members at that dinner, the aunts, the cousins, the people who had watched Raymond at the head of the table for decades and taken his version of events at face value, had read the documents. They had seen the forensic examiner's report. The reshaping of their understanding happened quietly, but completely. Marcus called me twice. The first call I did not answer. The second call, 2 weeks later, I answered. He said, "Mom, I think we need to talk." I said, "I agree. But I need you to understand that the talking we're going to do now is going to be very different from any talking we've done before. I am not forgiving my way through this one, Marcus. I am listening my way through it. That's different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know about the signatures." I believed him. That is the complicated truth of this story. I believe Marcus genuinely did not know the specific mechanism of what Raymond had done. He knew something was wrong. He saw my questions and chose to dismiss them because it served him to dismiss them. But the actual forgeries, I believe those were Raymond's architecture, built in the spaces where Marcus had made himself conveniently absent. That does not absolve him, but it changes the shape of things. The estate, properly reconstituted, restored what had been taken. The first check arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I held it in my hands for a long time before I deposited it. I thought about net worth, what it actually means, not as a number on a document, but as a lived reality, as the concrete accumulation of choices and time, and whether you have been allowed to keep what you built. This check was money that had always been mine. I was simply receiving it correctly for the first time. I deposited it. And then I drove to a flower market and I bought sunflowers. And I cried in my car for 7 minutes, and then I went home and put them in the kitchen next to my mother's Bible. The worn leather Bible with the handwritten notes in the margins. The third time that Bible matters in this story is the morning I opened it and wrote something in the margin myself for the first time. Next to the verse about truth setting you free, beside my mother's note about concealment and revelation, I wrote in my own handwriting, small and certain. I knew all along. I just needed spring to open the window. It felt like the correct completion of something she had started. The rebuilding was financial. Yes, rebuilt security and independence, concrete and real. Patricia connected me with a financial advisor named Wendell, who helped me understand what I actually owned now and how to protect it going forward. The income from the restored estate, combined with my own savings, and a decision to finally be strategic about my own wealth rather than everyone else's comfort, created something I had not had in 11 years. Stability that was entirely mine. Claudette and I have dinner every other Wednesday. We sit on her porch if the weather allows, and we talk the way women talk when they trust each other completely, which is to say about everything, without performance. She does not let me minimize what she did for me. I do not let her minimize what her presence meant in those months. We have an honest friendship, which I now understand is rarer and more valuable than almost anything else I can name. I am leaving Oakland, not because I lost this city or this neighborhood. I love the brick row houses and the small porches and the creaky stairs and the jasmine and exhaust smell of Bay Area spring mornings. I love the light on those houses at 6:47 a.m. I love who I was becoming here finally, after 48 years of practice. But I am choosing to go somewhere new the way you choose a sunrise over a sunset. Not because the day is over, but because you want to see what the light does at the beginning. There is a quiet town. Nobody knows my history there. I will arrive as whoever I decide to be, which is the first time that sentence has ever been available to me. The Lincoln Navigator in burgundy red is on order. I want you to know that. 11 years of telling myself I didn't deserve it. 11 years of calculating whether the thing I wanted most was practical, reasonable, appropriate for a woman in my position. The answer I have arrived at, after 48 years on this earth and one very instructive estate dispute, is that a woman in my position deserves every single beautiful thing she has been postponing. I am not apologizing for the Lincoln Navigator. I am parking it directly in front of wherever I land, and I am getting out of it slowly. It is autumn now. Oakland in October is different from Oakland in spring. The eucalyptus smell is sharper. The light sits lower and longer on the brick houses. The small porches hold people in sweaters now instead of shirt sleeves. The season has turned, and I have turned with it. And the woman standing at the kitchen sink this October morning is recognizably the same woman who stood there in April. Same rust-colored cardigan, same linoleum, same creaky stairs announcing the morning. And also fundamentally, irreversibly different. My boxes are almost packed. The worn leather Bible will be the last thing I wrap. I have not decided yet where to put it in the new place, whether it belongs in the bedroom or the kitchen, or some room that I haven't configured yet because I don't know what it will become. I think I will let it find its own spot, the way certain objects do when you give them room. My mother always said that a Bible knows where it belongs. I am inclined to believe her about most things. Marcus and I are not estranged. We are not what we were either, and what we were, which was a mother swallowing her perception to keep a son comfortable, is not something I am interested in recreating. We talk on the phone. He is working things out with his wife, who is a woman I have always privately liked, and who is navigating the revelation that her husband's financial expectations were built on a fraudulent foundation with more grace than I would have predicted. He has started therapy. He told me this with the halting embarrassment of a man who considers therapy an admission of failure, and I told him it was the opposite. I don't know if he believed me, but I said it, and that is what I can do. Gerald is not in Marcus's life anymore. The income that Gerald had leveraged, the fortune he had positioned as patronage in exchange for Marcus's loyalty, evaporated when the estate produced nothing, and the legal scrutiny made the association inconvenient. This is, I have come to understand, a specific and merciful kind of justice. Not the dramatic kind, not the courtroom kind, but the quiet arithmetic of relationships built on transactional expectation collapsing when the transaction fails to deliver. Raymond's attorney lost his license. The disbarred notary faced additional review. The estate was closed correctly. What was mine came back to me. Here is what I want to tell you, and I want to say it directly, without softening it, because I think you deserve the plain version. What happened to me was not just a family conflict. It was not just a legal matter, though it was also those things. What happened to me was a sustained campaign of financial and emotional exploitation that my own body eventually refused to absorb any longer. My blood pressure crisis at 178/112 was not a coincidence. My numbness, my blurred vision, my inability to eat the macaroni I made for no one, none of those things were random. The medical literature is unambiguous on this. Chronic stress from sustained emotional and financial abuse produces the same physiological damage as any other long-term illness. My doctor told me this, and I heard it. But I want you to hear it too, in the plain terms of someone who lived it. I gave this family my identity, my Thursdays, my name on documents I never saw, my silence in the face of things that frightened me, and my body sent the invoice when I had been ignoring the earlier ones. The bill for sustained self-abandonment is always presented eventually. It just finds its own timing. I was 48 years old when this happened. I was not elderly. I was not particularly vulnerable in any of the ways we imagine when we think about exploitation. I was a working woman with a green metal file cabinet and a lease on the second floor of a Victorian house in Oakland. And yet, the World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 6 seniors worldwide suffers abuse. Raymond, in his final years, occupied that category as perpetrator and as cautionary architecture. He had built the machinery of exploitation across decades and called it family. He had found a woman who believed in forgiveness as reflex and used that belief the way you use a lockpick, carefully, regularly, and always in his own interest. If you think that number sounds high, 1 in 6, hold this alongside it. According to American statistics, about 4 million seniors are victimized every year. Most of them by people who call themselves family. Most of them by people who show up to holiday dinners and birthdays and funerals and say loving things to rooms full of people while conducting the theft in the background. I was not a senior, but I was a woman who had been taught to prioritize family loyalty over self-knowledge, and that made me exactly as vulnerable as any number of people listening to this right now. The one concrete thing I want to tell you, the one piece of practical wisdom I can offer from the other side of all of this, is this. Know your name on paper. Know what accounts it appears on. Know who has access to what. Know the documents. The love you have for the people in your life is real and valid and worth protecting. But love is not a substitute for information, and forgiveness is not a replacement for accountability. Check the documents. Learn your name on paper. Know what you own before someone teaches you that you own nothing. I knew all along. My body knew. My instincts knew. The low, persistent frequency of wrongness I had been explaining away for 2 years, that was knowledge, not anxiety. The difference between those two things is worth learning earlier than I learned it. The sunflowers in my kitchen are fresh. I have been buying them weekly since May. It has become the smallest, most significant ritual of my week. Walking to the market, choosing the brightest ones, bringing them home with my own money, setting them next to my mother's Bible, watching them turn toward the window. They always turn toward the window. It is not a metaphor I manufactured. It is simply what they do. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely, not as a formality. Where are you listening from today? Because I find myself thinking about the people who hear this story. Whether they are sitting in a working-class neighborhood with brick row houses and small porches, or somewhere with no porch at all, somewhere they are trying to figure out if what they are feeling is instinct or paranoia, if the low frequency they cannot name is real or imagined. I want to know where you are, because wherever you are is the right place to hear this. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are, and tell me, what would you have done? At that dinner table, with the folder in your hand and 42 family members and your son across the room, what would you have done? If this story reached something in you, if you recognized any corner of it, click like, because that tells me the right people are finding it. And subscribe, because I have more of these stories, and the women in them deserve to be heard. The Lincoln Navigator is burgundy red. The town is quiet. Nobody knows my history. I am beginning.